Hi, friends. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. I hope, regardless of whatever you celebrate, you are having a good celebration. I don't know if today's live stream is going to be especially well attended. I doubt it will be, but I mean, I just wanted to have fun. I wanted to talk about an especially interesting deity and also an extremely relevant one to the mythos of Pathfinder and also specifically the world of Galarian, which is sort of the assumed slash most fleshed out world in all of Pathfinder, both first and second edition. And so I wanted us to start off and just dive right on into talking about Rovagug, the god of destruction. So Rovagog manifests most commonly, and I suppose you could say that Rovagog's like true form is just a positively enormous beetle of unimaginable power. It's worth mentioning that Rovagug is kind of a Qwiploth Lord. He is in fact thought to be the most powerful Qwiploth Lord in existence. Qwiploth Lords are a type of higher being in Pathfinder, so they are akin to demon lords and archdevils and imperial lords, which are the generic, like, good higher beings. Also, hey Alhana, I hope that you're having a great day so far. I don't know what time it is where you live, because I know you live in like a very different time zone than I do. But I'm very excited that you could make it. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think that today's live stream is going to be like especially well attended. It's Christmas and stuff. So I just wanted to have fun, and I have a tradition of doing live streams on Christmas, so I wanted to continue that tradition. I also didn't really feel like talking about anything super festive, and talking about a god of destruction is a fun way of killing some time, because that's what we're doing today. So Rovagog, the god of destruction, who's also, I guess, just the god of the positively worst people in all of Pathfinder. One of like the most irritating deities, and also a surprisingly influential one, specifically in the world of Galarian, is stuck in the center of the world. And he's stuck there because his ass got handed to him a few ages ago. So like in what was effectively Galarian's prehistory, during a war that occurred at the end of the Age of Creation. So for those of you who are not super familiar with Pathfinder lore, there are different ages which Galarian specifically, but also the universe to a lesser extent that Pathfinder takes place in, could be categorized. The Age of Creation is the first age that not the first, it's like the second age that Galarian can be categorized into. And there are a few other ages. One of the really cool ages is the Age of Serpents, which is the first age from which people can find historical things that super distinctly exist just all over Galarian. And during the Age of Serpents, one of the big events that occurred was the founding of the nation of Gul'dan, which is a Cyclops civilization, which at first was super civilized and extremely advanced. It was one of the most advanced ages in the world at that time. But then they went into the Darklands in order to find serpent folks. And if you are not at all familiar with Pathfinder, but you are familiar with D&D, you can think of the Darklands as Pathfinder's equivalent of the Underdark. And while they were fighting off the serpent folk empire and they were bringing it to an end, they were corrupted by the things that they saw in the Darklands. They were corrupted by the religious practices of the serpent folks, and they began to fracture into different civilizations, all of which is actually like really neat. I'm almost certainly going to do a video specifically on Gul'dan. It probably will be a live stream, especially because I'm actually having a lot of fun with these live streams. I really like talking about lore in this format. It's fun to have a chance to like just talk about other things for a few seconds. This empire would begin to fracture by the end of the Age of Serpents, and it would be pretty much irredeemably corrupted, and the Cyclopses themselves would fall, and they would, I guess, almost devolve to a certain extent because of the religious practices of their ancestors, which seeped into their souls, and among other things, corrupted one of their most noteworthy abilities, which is the ability to see into the future to a certain extent. This also gets especially messy during the current age in which all of Galarian's adventure paths take place, which is known as the Age of Lost Omens. That age began just about a century, like just over a century ago, according to the years that the current adventure path, like the most recent one, takes place. And the Age of Lost Omens began with the death of Aradin, who was the god of humanity and was one of the very first ascended deities. An ascended deity is a deity whose ascension came as a result of them doing something in history. And it was someone who was immortal who became a deity, specifically through the Starstone, which is one fragment of one of the meteorites that was supposed to rain on Earth during, not on Earth, but on Galarian during an event known as Earthfall. I don't want to get too much into that specific mythology and that specific history because that's not the focus of today's video, but it's really cool stuff which will be discussed during another adventure path. One of the consequences of the death of Aradin is that prophecies started messing up for reasons that are not super clear in lore and reasons that are confusing to deities of things like prophecy, which include Pharasma, who was the main focus of our last live stream. Also, hey Zal, I hope that you're having a great day today. Happy holidays to you too. I have a feeling that you would like the main topic of today's video, which is Rovagug, the god of destruction. Hell yeah. And now we're actually going to begin to talk about Rovagug himself. So there are myths which suggest that Rovagug is the manifestation of one of Pharasma's fears. In prehistory, when Pharasma was creating all things that would exist at some point in the future, her fears began to manifest. And one of the fears, it's not super clear which, became Rovagug. And Rovagug's first duty was to burrow through the abyss, which is part of the reason why some of the older deities that we're going to be talking about, deities who began to exist and are almost as old as the current universe that Pathfinder takes place in, didn't realize what Rovagug was doing at first. It's not super clear if they were unaware of Rovagug or if they were just willing to let him just sort of destroy the abyss, which was what he was doing at the beginning of his existence. He is probably the first Quiplath Lord. It's suggested in some in-game resources that he is the oldest of the Quiplath Lords and also that he's the most powerful. And once Rovagug was done burrowing through the abyss and creating the infinite layers of chaos and evil that the abyss would later become known for, he managed to make it to the mortal plane, which is when shit starts to get really messy. So Rovagug, as a deity of destruction and as a manifestation of chaos, evil, and hatred, is a really rad-sounding deity, and there are lots of super cool campaign ideas, which we will be talking about at the end of this live stream. That's probably how I'm going to end it, with a section on how you can use Rovagug in your campaigns. Has been an antagonist, not just in really minor ways, and hey, I don't think I can say that name, but I can say is Spiny Hurt. It's really nice to see you. I hope that you're having a great day or night. I don't know what time zone you're from. I have a feeling I know who you are. I have a feeling you're one of my Discord friends, which is super exciting. I'm super glad that you're here. Also, if it looks like I'm reacting to chat slow, it's because even though I normally have my chat stuff up to the side, I actually wrote out a list of things I wanted to talk about for this video. So that way I could talk about them and I would be able to hit all the stuff I wanted to do before I started just talking about everything. Oh, that's super cool. It's nice to see you, Ben. I'm very happy that you were able to make it today. Rovagug is a Pathfinder deity, so he's not going to be in our D&D campaign, but I really like him. He's a very fun creature to use, and I think that he could probably translate well to D&D if someone wanted to convert stuff, even though I'm not super into that. Also, hey Capri, it's nice to see you too. I'm super excited that so many people are actually making it. I didn't think that we would be getting that much of an audience today, just because it either is Christmas or it's Christmas Eve, depending on where you live. But yeah, so Rovagog managed to make it to the mortal plane, which is where humans and orcs and Galarian live/are. And Rovagog immediately began just wrecking house. Rovagog went on entire rampages that would entirely wipe out civilizations and planets, because deities in Pathfinder are not exactly something that mortals can stop. If you make it past the level of demi-deity / demigod, you are a CR probably upwards of 30 creature. And that is just something that is effectively unstoppable unless you are like an army of mythic level players. So effectively, this giant demon monster, not a demon, a Qiploth, but effectively this giant demon monster would make it to a planet and would start immediately eating everything and/or viciously killing it. It's actually like a really interesting thing to think about. One of the things that I would do if I were writing an adventure path that were centered around Rovagug is I would actually find a way to let players witness visions of the ancient past, during which Rovagug was able to just freely annihilate things and was rampaging throughout the universe. I think that's one of the more interesting points in Pathfinder's history. It seems like a simple enough era, but effectively what happened was that after a while, the gods and goddesses that were created at pretty much the beginning of time and that survived the initial chaos of one of the first eras of universal history saw what Rovagug was doing, and they understood that Rovagug was trying to annihilate life. That's Rovagug's sort of raison d'etre. I can't pronounce that word, but it's his reason for being. He hates all things and he wants to see everything disappear. So what he does is when he gets to a world, he goes on a rampage, and unless someone stops him, he just devours everything, and then he fucks off to another planet to do that again. It's a really simple enemy. It's effectively the Tarrasque of Pathfinder, which is very funny because Tarrasques also exist in Pathfinder and are actually like the spawn of Rovagug, which is a type of classification that suggests that you are one of Rovagug's children. Very interesting lore-wise stuff, but basically, if you're a spawn of Rovagug, you are a giant evil monster that wants to devour everything. There's no complex backstory there. It's super simple. It's super easy to use. All of the spawn of Rovagug, though, are like immeasurably powerful monsters. So I would recommend that you not fuck with them unless you are in an extremely high-level Pathfinder campaign. Or the goal of like fighting it isn't just to kill it, but to do something else, which also works. That's another fun thing you could do with it. But a bunch of deities, including Callistra, who's the elven goddess of passion, lust, revenge, and wasps, among other things, Torag, the supposed creator of the dwarves, Asmodeus, an explicitly evil deity who wants to rule all of existence and probably will at some point just because he has that big brain. Gorum, the ancient god of war, and Sarenrae, who is probably like the most famous Pathfinder deity. As I mentioned during my last live stream, she is the deity that Pike worshipped at the beginning of Critical Role before they made Critical Role into a 5th edition campaign as opposed to like a Pathfinder one. They all formed an ancient alliance, an alliance that was effectively unthinkable, just because it like formed from deities of effectively like every possible alignment combination. There were actually hundreds of deities that were in this alliance, but the overwhelming majority of them just died when they were fighting against Rovagug. So I'm now seeing stuff that I should look at. So do they get satisfaction when they destroy a planet? It's not super clear. It's not really clear if Rovagug actively likes the destruction it causes, or if it just thinks that that's like its whole thing. That's like its reason for being. It probably doesn't, but I have a feeling a lot of people underestimate the intelligence of Rovagug. A lot of people probably think that it's just this unthinking entity that just wants destruction and is like an animal, but instead of wanting to like reproduce and survive. It just wants to destroy everything. I don't think that that's really fair to Rovagug, because Rovagug can answer prayers, and Rovagug has worshippers. There are people who are tricked one way or another, and people who are corrupted into worshiping it, which implies that it has some level of intelligence. It's also implied that it's capable of like dreaming and like remembering its dreams in some of the lore that describes Rovagug. So I think it's probably fair to say that like it wants to destroy everything, or it feels like that's its purpose, and it won't let anything stop it, which is actually really interesting. But so when all of the gods formed their alliance in order to destroy Rovagug, what ended up happening was Callistra, who I mentioned earlier, ended up leading a force that would destroy, that would be largely destroyed by Rovagug, but their whole purpose was to distract it. The plan was to lead the deity to Galarian. Either that, or Galarian is just like where the deities were when they had that final confrontation with Rovagug. And while Callistra was distracting the thing, and all of her friends were like largely being slaughtered, because this is a god that's whole existence is violence and destruction, it's not exactly a fair fight to put it up against other deities who might be concerned with things like family and community, like Aristil, which is an actual deity that exists in Pathfinder. He's a cool deer-headed dude. So no one worships it willingly. Some people do worship it willingly. Rovagug is one of the patron deities of orcs. He's not like the only patron deity of orcs. Some orcs worship Lamashtu, who's like just this evil asshole who's worshipped by like mothers who don't want their kids to have deformities. The insane, but like in like the eldritch D&D way, where like being insane is bad and not like a defect. It's really weird because it's like RPG insanity, not real insanity, which is like very ableistic. And also like just a whole bunch of like different types of monsters. So Rovagug does have willing worshippers. There's actually a character in one of the Pathfinder books who is a worshiper of Rovagug, and he's the central antagonist of the book. The whole book revolves around this family in the land of the Linorm Kings, who took in a frost giant. I think it was a frost giant, and they like adopted him. And he went insane. He slaughtered the family, and then he fled into the Darklands because he was a worshiper of Rovagug, and Rovagug promised to give him the power to like right the wrongs that were done to him. So he was trying to perform a rite that would weaken the bonds that held Rovagug. And it's actually really interesting. It suggests that like there are people who are capable of doing such a thing, which is Rovagug's whole thing right now. Rovagug right now just wants to escape the prison that he's sealed in. And as we've mentioned before, as we talked about in the last live stream, eventually Rovagug will escape the Dead Vault, which is the name of the prison that currently holds him. And when he does, it will be the beginning of the end of all of existence. So like, right now, even though the deities at the time hoped they would be able to seal him away forever because he was a giant asshole who was running around killing all of their worshippers, and they're just like, hey, that's not cool, and we can't really reason with you. All you want to do is break shit. I guess we're just going to have to fuck you up. They did want to kill him, but they knew they wouldn't be able to, because when you're a deity, when you're a creature that's that powerful, your portfolios and the things that you're like concerned with and the ways that your worshippers believe you sort of like form a shield around you, and they make it difficult for things to happen to you. Basically, the rules for D&D deities are taken and they're amplified for Pathfinder deities. No true deity in Pathfinder has been given a stat block, because they are existences that are just beyond the ability of player characters to kill. I personally am not like a huge fan of that system, but I understand it. Like in D&D, deities are given stat blocks, which suggests to players who read like enough of the lore and who have been playing long enough that you can kill a deity. Though even in D&D, when you kill a deity, you don't actually kill it, you just disincorporate it, which means that you destroy its physical form and it has to go to like its divine realm and like take a while to reform. You have to do special things if you want to like actually kill the deity, with the most well-known and the most universal being that you kill all of its worshippers, unless it's an over deity, in which case it's unconcerned with worshippers. So if you become a strong enough deity, it doesn't matter if you have worshippers or not. Ao is probably the most well-known D&D over deity, and he's just mind-fuckingly powerful. There's just nothing you can do to stop him. It's honestly kind of funny because he's not even the most powerful creature in D&D lore. This isn't a D&D lore video, though. So all of the gods worked together in different ways in order to take down Rovagug. Sarenrae, who we talked about earlier, would be the deity who came in clutch. But while Calistro was distracting Rovagug, Asmodeus, Gorum, Torag, and Don Berthal, which is Zan Kuthan, before he became corrupted, worked together to form a like prison for him and locks. And once they had that, they threw it into the center of Galarian, and they told Sarenrae that it was time to finally fuck up Rovagug. Sarenrae and Rovagug had probably the most explosive confrontation that's like an explicit event in Pathfinder lore, with like one of the other exceptions being when I think her name was Avankha. I'll put it in the comments. AC, a moon goddess from Althalkani times, took one for the team and sacrificed herself to save Galarian from the event known as Earthfall. But effectively, Sarenrae fought Rovagug and kind of won. She defeated him, but she couldn't kill him. So instead of trying to kill him, what she ended up doing was she tore a hole into the center of Galarian with her sword, and it went from the surface all the way to the planet's molten core, and she threw Rovagug's defeated body in there. When it reached the center of the planet, the Dead Vault, which is the name of the prison / demiplane that currently houses Rovagug, wrapped around him and trapped him like he was an insect that was trapped in amber, and effectively prevented him from doing all of the shit that he was doing before. So Rovagug's current state is that he's trapped in the Dead Vault. He's not powerless because, you know, the Dead Vault is an imperfect prison that's eventually going to break. Sooner or later, someone is going to do something that causes the prison to break and causes the end of all of existence. Hey, Christy, I hope that you're having a great day. It's super exciting to see you here. I know that I don't often do non-political things in live streams, but I'm having fun doing some D&D lore. So it's super exciting to see some of my buddies here. There are interesting implications with the Dead Vault in other games, specifically Starfinder, because in Starfinder, Galarian vanishes. For those of you who don't know, Starfinder is effectively sci-fi Pathfinder, but it takes place in the distant future, including a period in which no one can remember stuff that happened, and during that period, Galarian vanished from where it once was, and a place called like the Absalon Space Station took its place, which is actually really interesting, but it does not have the Dead Vault. And like in the lore of Starfinder, they are very explicit about the fact that Galarian used to exist, and I'm pretty sure they've mentioned that some of the deities that existed during Galarian's time still exist. Some of them are still worshipped. People like Sarenrae and Zan-Kuthan exist in Starfinder, and it talks about the fact that Rovagug once existed. So that's just a little continuity thing. But effectively, the current understanding is that, at least in the specific universe and the specific timeline that Pathfinder takes place, once the Dead Vault opens, that's one of the events that triggers the end of this current iteration of reality. And I'm super excited that so many people are here, including you, Christy. I want people to know that I am reading the comments. It's just that, like, I do want to get through, like, the stuff, because it's well known among my friends who watch me frequently that it's really easy to get me off topic. And sometimes that leads to live streams that have, like, actual topics being derailed, which happens and is fun, but I don't want it to happen today. So effectively, Rovagug is currently vibing in its prison cell. That doesn't mean that it's not able to do nothing, because it has very real, very objective powers. It can answer prayers, and it can, like, give power to its clerics, because in Pathfinder, clerics gain their power from their deities. Now, not every single cleric has this limitation. Some clerics have, like, a sort of font of divine energy within themselves, and that manifests and gives them things like oracle-based abilities, which are both explicitly divine and not necessarily explicitly tied to a deity, but definitely can be. And also, like, other types of creatures which can use divine magic but don't pray to things. But Rovagug does answer prayers. Rovagug does listen to prayers, and it attempts to corrupt people. It wants to be freed from its prison, and the current beliefs amongst its believers, we're now entering the period where, like, I can just sort of riff for a bit, which is very exciting, because I prefer this. I prefer this sort of, like, live stream as opposed to one where I'm, like, trying to make super specific points. Some of the beliefs amongst the believers of Rovagug are things like, oh, hey, Rovagug doesn't want to end all of existence and just wipe everything out. Rovagug actually wants to wipe out existence and then create a new existence. And if you are a Rovagugian, which I guess is what we'll use to describe the believers in Rovagug, then you will be one of the kings and queens of this new reality. But this is probably a minority of Rovagugians. Most Rovagugians are nihilists who want to see the end of time. They are creatures who want to see everything that exists be unmade, which is really good, because Rovagug is known as the unmaker. Like, Rovagug does not exactly lie to its believers. It is very explicit in what it wants. It wants all things that live to die. And I really like that simplicity. I myself, I've talked about this before, but I like creatures that are, like, elementally evil. So not creatures that are like, oh no, you're a morally complex antagonist. I think that can be fun, and I think that has, like, its place in role-playing. But sometimes, if you are someone who is playing a role-playing game, you want an antagonist that you just want to beat. You want an antagonist that is just unapologetically evil. It's not lying about what it wants. It's not trying to, like, be like Thanos in the movies, where, like, it has, like, a vaguely sympathetic goal, which is very different from Thanos in the comics, by the way. Thanos in the comics did not have, like, a redeemable goal. He wasn't trying to make things better. In most comics, he was in love with death, and he thought that, like, killing things would give him attention from death, who was herself in love with Deadpool. The Marvel universe is really weird. I'm really simplifying, like, a lot of shit. So, like, if you are really into the Marvel universe, I promise that it's more complex than that. But the comics, they didn't try to make Thanos this, like, sympathetic guy. I really liked comic book Thanos, because he was just like, yeah, he's a bad guy who is just really evil. You got to beat that bad guy, and you got to save the world. Nothing really morally ambiguous about that, which is very nice. But yeah, so it is different. Rovagug presents an easy-to-understand antagonist. He wants to escape. He wants to destroy everything. And frankly, if he does escape, he will have the power to destroy everything. But now we're talking about, like, Rovagugians and stuff. And now we're getting into the point of, how could you use Rovagug in your Pathfinder campaign? I almost said D&D. I'm doing my best. I'm tired. I'm here. I'm vibing. Yeah. So basically, if you want a simple antagonist that, if it gets freed, it represents the end, you can use Rovagug in your campaign. Now, if you want to get more interesting with Rovagug, there are different things that you can explore. You could talk about Rovagugians, who are possibly redeemable people. So not every single believer in Rovagug is going to be equally tied to the idea of Rovagug being free and destroying everything. And especially if you come across the sort of believers in Rovagug who are misguided, the sort who think that Rovagug wants to remake reality as opposed to just annihilate everything, you can have an antagonist that you can defeat and then you can redeem. If you are not super interested in that, but you just want people who worship Rovagug and they're just like fully committed, they're fully on board with the annihilation of everything, with oblivion, then you could probably use things like Drow who've been converted into Rovagugian worship. You can use orcs, who are often worshippers of Rovagug. You could use frost giants, which is what they did in that novel that I talked about towards the beginning of the stream. Just because frost giant like culture, as it's described in the Pathfinder resource books and in like all the books that have been written on like giants and stuff in Pathfinder, it's not exactly the hardest thing to just sort of like corrupt someone who is seeped into that culture at birth. If you are curious as to what I'm talking about, effectively what you need to know is that frost giants in Pathfinder are effectively like a corruption and bastardization of Norse culture. It's definitely like in that general area. It's the idea of like a civilization of people who make their living on slaving, on raiding and like destruction. So they're pretty easy targets. Different giants in Pathfinder lore represent different archetypes. In some cases, like the cloud giants and the storm giants, these are fantasy archetypes. And then in other cases, like the hill giants and the frost giants, these are supposedly historical archetypes, and they're just like really big, larger than life embodiments of these sorts of ideas. So there are lots of different groups that are pretty easy to make into Rovagugians. Generally, if someone worships Lamashtu, which is another goddess, she's actually the only demon lord, or she was in first edition, the only demon lord to go from being a demon lord, which is a type of higher being, into a true deity. In second edition, there is another demon lord who does this, which is actually really interesting. But Lamashtu is the goddess of motherhood, monsters, nightmares, and like plagues. And she is just a comically evil deity, in much the same sense as Rovagug. She's just a source of elemental evil, which is like super easy for you to use in your campaign. If you just want a generic baddie that you guys want to defeat, if you don't want to make like a super complex storyline or whatever, you could definitely use Lamashtu or Rovagug. If you are curious, the other demon lord to ascend from being a demon lord into being a true deity is Noctula, who is like a main character in one specific adventure path, Wrath of the Righteous. And effectively, she is actually really distinct. She was the first succubus, and she was like a victim of other evil demon lords who wanted to use and abuse her, but she started killing them. And after a while, she started to really, really like what happened when she killed demon lords, which would effectively be that like something about her made it so that the normal fate that befell a killed demon lord, which is to go into a specific layer of the abyss known as the Rift of Repose and form like a statue there and just vibe for eternity, was disrupted, and they instead became islands in her abyssal lair. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. I can only know so much like lore at one time before some of it starts to get phased out. But over the course of the Wrath of the Righteous, she kills at least one demon lord, even though that specific death isn't super permanent, because demon lords are very powerful creatures, and killing them once isn't usually enough to kill them. And over the course, like at some point between the events of first edition Pathfinder and second edition Pathfinder, she ascends from being a demon lord to becoming a true deity. So she does what Lamashtu and what Rovagug did, but she doesn't become an evil deity of generically evil things. She becomes a goddess of refugees, artists, and like creatives. and she becomes a neutral goddess, which is actually incredibly interesting. Noctula is like one of my favorite characters in all of Pathfinder lore. She is extremely interesting because as like a demon lord, she was a demon lord of succubi, assassins, lust, and darkness. And then she just becomes the super rad goddess of artists, refugees, and creatives. And honestly, like, though, I guess those are like maturity goals, you know, she stops being evil, she starts just vibing. In the actual adventure path that she's in, she's not even an antagonist. I'm not going to talk too much about what she does because that would be like, if I go into like the specifics, it would be like super huge spoilers. So I'm not going to do that. But like, it's ultra canon now, not just that the events of first edition Wrath of the Righteous happened more or less as they're described in the adventure path, but also that like at some point she ascends, which is super rad, and I love that for her, just like Zal said. But yeah, so if you want to use Rovagug in your campaigns, it's not exactly super complex, just so long as you're just like, hey, I need a super simple antagonist who creates like villains that are like some cases redeemable and some cases not redeemable. One of Rovagug's big things is that he's capable of corrupting people, and also sometimes some of his children will escape. I talked about this earlier. I mentioned the Tarask, which is the latest sort of herald of Rovagug. If you are not super familiar with like the nuances of Pathfinder lore, every true deity, which is like a sort of classification of a creature's power level, effectively anything that's like over CR 30 to 35, like the most incredibly powerful creatures in all of Pathfinder, every single one of those assholes that's a true deity has a herald, which is a unique servant that has been imbued with a portion of their divine power. In Rovagug's case, the current herald is the Tarask, which is a lot more like older edition D&D Tarasks than they are like newer edition D&D Tarasks. Among other things, the Tarask is a unique entity of which there is only one in Pathfinder, which is sort of the case, sort of not the case in D&D. If I remember correctly, in D&D, it's like every world has its own Tarask in some editions, and in other editions, there's like only one Tarask, which exists in whatever setting that you're in. And effectively, it's an unkillable god monster, just like it is in D&D, which is super exciting for some people. If you really like the old Tarask and you really want to have that as like a sort of ultra antagonist for a campaign, that's a much more achievable goal than being like, hey, we're going to go into the Dead Vault and we're going to fuck up Rovagug forever and we're going to prevent this universe from ending, because that's like one of the big heralds of the end times when Rovagug gets unleashed. That means that you would have to enter the Dead Vault, which is complicated for a number of reasons, and you would have to kill Rovagug, which is frankly even harder. An alliance of gods, most of the prime deities that have existed since the beginning of time came together, and they couldn't do that shit at like the height of their power. So it's really difficult for me to imagine that a group of player characters would be able to do that in a way that actually sticks. Although you can have Rovagug like manifest like an avatar or whatever, and you can have that be the sort of ultra antagonist, which could actually be really fun. The way that I could imagine that working, if I were to be a GM and I were to have like some sort of evil scheme, I would effectively have the player characters think that they were going to fight the Tarask and win, and then the like explosion of divine energy manifests as an avatar of Rovagug, and it would be the actual final fight of the campaign. And I think that would be really fun. That's a really neat way to like be like, hey, you guys wanted to fight Rovagug? Well, have fun. Which honestly would be very funny to me. That's the sort of thing that I would find amusing to do. I could also imagine that like more murder happy DMs would enjoy that too. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being a murder GM. I just think that that's not the way that I would normally like to play as a GM, because normally I want to tell a story, but if you've already told the full story and you're just at the end and you want to have like a truly epic, you want to have like a truly epic final fight, that would be a cool way to close out a campaign. Just face off against Rovagug. There are other spawns of Rovagug that exist. One of them is Extoli, the Fire Breather, or like the Fire Bleeder, who is a minor antagonist in one of the very first adventure paths. It is a sort of like end campaign final boss, so I'm not going to say which one, but it's like, I think it's like in the first 4 adventure paths you come across Extoli. I can't remember exactly which one. There's also a city in Osarian where like one of the older spawn of Rovagug that got positively annihilated by like the entire city and like an army, and I think like an avatar of one of the main deities coming together and just being like, no, fuck you, before it could annihilate the city. But yeah. I'm glad that you are having fun, Christy. That sounds like a nice way to be spending Christmas Eve. I'm glad that you're doing good. I don't think that we're going to make this campaign last like too much longer. I think that I want to talk about like a few instances in Pathfinder where there are worshippers of Rovagug, because they do exist. In one case, there's like a really weird epic level place that adventurers can go to. It's a tower that's located in Nidal, which is where Zon-Cathon, it's a country that Zon-Cathon, one of the deities who was part of the Alliance, sort of vibes sometimes. It's a nation that he indirectly rules, that he helped get through Earthfall, which was a cataclysmic apocalyptic event that happened in the ancient past. And Rovagug was one of the deities who helped put down, Zon-Cathon was one of the deities who helped put down Rovagug. And this was before Zon-Cathon became Zon-Cathon. And in order for the prison to stay intact, one of the things that Don Brethal, which was Dobrall, I'm just going to type this name in because I can't say it for shit. Dol Brawl, there. One of the things that he did was he put a giant spike into Galarian, and that was one of the locks that would be on the prison. And this area, I think it's called like the Star Tower. I think that's its name, but I can't remember it super clearly off the top of my head, is a place for mythical level / epic level, if you're a D&D person, players to go if they want to involve Rovagug and Zon-Cathon in their campaign. And it is a place that's overseen by a sort of mini herald, a sort of servitor of Zon-Cathon. And currently, I think it's either a hag or a Kython, which is a type of extraplanar being. Kythons are super interested in pain. They're effectively Cenobites. If you are familiar with, I think, the Hellraiser franchise, they're effectively Cenobites. And one of them is the steward of this place. And this place has a very interesting history that I'm not going to be able to dive into. But effectively, what's going on right now is that there is a weird alliance of people who worship Desna, which is a good goddess of dreams, outer space, and like exploration, and people who worship freaking Rovagug, who are trying to stop the current steward of the tower. Theoretically, the steward of the tower can be changed, and that's like one of the things that mythic level players can do. If they want to run the tower in a way that's like less evil, because the current steward of the tower oppresses anyone who comes into it and doesn't let them leave, they could sacrifice one of the players, and the player would make a contract with Zon-Cathon where they become the new herald if they're able to successfully kill the old herald. Not a herald of Zon-Cathon, but like the herald of the tower. The herald of Zon-Cathon is actually Zon-Cathon's dad, which is a giant wolf that's now covered in chains. Deity, like, lore and deity genetics don't make sense in Pathfinder. So this giant wolf apparently impregnated a person, like one other ancient spirit, and they had 2 kids. Don Brawl was one of them, and then the goddess of like beautiful things, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head, was the other. And in the ancient past, they were Shaylin. That's her name. In the ancient past, they were really tight friends. They were like best friends. But then Zon Cathan decided that some like event happened to him, and he was like, you know what? I'm going to have a temper tantrum, and I am going to go outside of the known multiverse. I'm going to have a conversation, I guess, with the people who lurk outside of the multiverse, which is actually what we talked about in last week's live stream. We talked about those who remain. And when he came back, he was ultra evil. But before he became ultra evil, he was a really cool guy who was like a god of like generic good things. And he had like a specific portfolio that's detailed somewhere, but I can't remember what it was off the top of my head. But when he came back, he was the deity of darkness, pain, and pleasure. And he's actually a really interesting deity who could also make for some really cool, like, mythos-related stuff. But his homie is running the tower, and she's an asshole, which is why cultists who worship the god of destruction and also the god of dreams and shit have come together, and they're just like, hey, we all know that like we're all categorically opposed to each other, but like the biggest threat right now is that fucking asshole, so we're gonna take her out. I remember very explicitly that she's a she. It's detailed in like the Mythical Places handbook, which is one of the big player resources for if you want to run a mythic level campaign, which is just Pathfinder's like really in-universe, really neat way of saying epic level campaign. If you think CR20 is not a high enough level for your campaign, or if you're starting off a high level campaign and you want to keep going beyond CR20, what you would do is you would have mythic adventures, which are very fun and involve some of the coolest stuff in Pathfinder. I really like them. But that's an instance where Rovagugians are actually not the biggest threats, and they're a force that you can sort of work with, that you can collaborate with, and that wouldn't just fuck your whole shit up because they have bigger fish to fry. An instance where Rovagugians are one of the bigger threats is going back to Osarian, which is a place that we've talked about before. Osarian is effectively Egypt, but in Galarian, to the point where the deities that were, and in some cases are, worshipped by people in Osarian are literally the exact deities who are worshipped in our Earth's ancient Egypt. It's explicitly mentioned in lore that they are the exact same creatures because Earth exists in Pathfinder lore and is a place you can visit, and there are adventures that take place on Earth, which is honestly the coolest shit in the world. I'm now getting to the point where I'm sort of riffing, so I'm really just having fun. But there was a pharaoh or a pharaohess who worshipped Rovagug openly. And she was reviled by the people of Osarian because she was super bloodthirsty and she like hated life and shit. So they're just like, you know what? We think maybe you shouldn't be a leader of our country of living people if you dislike the living. And honestly, I'm not going to get political here, but I think that maybe we should learn from that. I think that maybe if there's politicians who just objectively seem to hate all life, maybe we should do something about them. So what they did was they built a giant pyramid to house her ass, and then they threw her in it. She was a very bloodthirsty pharaohess. She'd performed like human sacrifices, and she became a lich, which is actually like a key point in this adventure. But there is a resource book that talks about like dungeons in Galarian, and it talks about like places where adventurers can go and like where you could have like entire campaigns if you wanted. And her pyramids are one of them. I personally think that they're probably like the most interesting location in there, because even though Rovagugians are like the main people in it, they're not the only people in it. And there's also like different cults of Rovagugians. So just because like most of the people in the pyramid itself worship Rovagug doesn't mean they all worship him the same way. There's the Sisters of like Blinding Purity, which is a group of sexy ladies who dress really sexily and they carry like poison daggers. And there's also like the Plague Brothers or something, and they are just positively filthy men who run around trying to get people sick, and they also use like poisoned weapons as well. And there's also a cult of hags, a coven of hags who are just like, yeah, we call ourselves the Brides of Rovagug, and our goal is to bring him to this world, and then, I don't know, either witness the destruction of the world, or I guess have sexy times with Rovagug. Probably not that one, but that's a very funny thought to me, as someone who has spent way too much time reading this lore. And I mean, I'm glad that I'm now trying to do something with all of this Pathfinder lore that I have just idly in my head. But I'm obviously a very silly person, and this is obviously a very silly live stream, but it's Christmas, so whatever. And that's a very interesting adventure because the first sets of antagonists you're going to find are Rovagugians, but they're not the only antagonists, because the pyramid has a section that is underground, and that section goes to the Darklands, which is, as I've mentioned before, just Pathfinder's Underdark. And there's a whole bunch of evil creatures that worship other evil things that are just vibing in that area. A lot of them are like demon worshippers, which is like a really common thing among the people who live in the Darklands. If you're a Darklands person, there's a very healthy chance that you are a dark elf. And if you're a dark elf in Pathfinder and you are running like a strict Pathfinder lore-based campaign, then you're going to be a demon worshipper, or you're going to worship Ugothra, who's the goddess of plagues, undeath, and also pleasure. Lots of things like pleasure. For Zon-Kathan, it's more like pain and pleasure mixed together, but for Ugothra, it's more pleasure in the hedonistic sense. So she's worshipped by people who really like sexy times, as well as by people who want to eat everything. If you're a glutton, or if you're an undead who has some sort of mind, you're probably an Ugothran. I really like Ugothra. She's one of the more interesting underutilized deities in Pathfinder. Honestly, all of these deities are really cool, and I'm probably going to have like specific videos devoted to all of them. But now for shit that Rovagug objectively did. Rovagug once corrupted a place called Gormunds, and this was a city that was near where like you could enter his prison. His whispers just sort of drove the people of the city insane. And one of those people was a herald of Sarenrae. So, you know, the super powerful beings who've been imbued with divine power. And Sarenrae saw that shit, and she wasn't having it for a second. So she immediately annihilated the city. She just vaporized it because she's the goddess of the sun. So it's really weird to talk about the fact that there's a goddess of Galarian sun, like specifically, but there's also a goddess of stars, which we mentioned earlier, named Desna. So the way that they explain it in like the resources that exist is effectively that Desna has like influence over stars in general, and also stars as like a concept, but Sarenrae is specifically the goddess of Galarian's like star, which is a place that you can do adventures on if you have fireproof people. That's not the only obstacle that would actually stop an adventure from happening on the sun in real life, but it's fantasy, so whatever. And it's very silly. But effectively, Sarenrae saw that this shit was happening, and she immediately annihilated the city. And she told her people to not go there again. And I don't remember if she like created a pit there, but there is a region known as the Pit of Gormunds, which is one of the ways that someone could theoretically get to the Dead Vault. At the very least, the outside of it. It's not super clear if someone would be able to enter it just because they got to the outside of it. But that means that in canon, there is a giant hole somewhere in Galarian that leads you from the surface of the world to the core of the planet, which is a very funny thing to think about. And that area is largely controlled by Rovagugians. It's also one of the places that's detailed in the like mythical adventures handbook that I talked about earlier, where it's like, hey, if you want to do mythic level shit, you can go over here because there's like enemies over there that are strong enough to actually challenge you and make you like fight and stuff. So yeah, if you want to do that, you can. But effectively, the whole thing that's there is like you can see the like ruins of the destroyed city, and also you can go and you could try to get over to Rovagug if you wanted to destroy him, or if you were running an evil campaign, an evil Rovagugian campaign. You could be playing Rovagugians who wanted to free him, which is also a thing that you could try to do. If you wanted to actually try and free him, like in canon, there's no super explicit way to do it, but there are suggestions throughout the lore that are like, hey, these are things that help keep Rovagug in his prison. One of the big ones that Rovagugians believe is that, generally speaking, across like all sects of Rovagugians, they believe that if you commit acts of destruction and acts of evil, that weakens the holds that have kept Rovagug in place for a period that's probably in, if not the hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of years. So basically, just be a dick. But they also believe specifically that the destruction of beautiful things helps keep Rovagug, like helps free Rovagug. But Rovagug is not just capable of like corrupting people like super directly. It's implied in the area where the Pit of Gormuz is talked about that he was wanting to, that he actively wanted to corrupt the people of Gormuz. He is capable of doing it like less directly and less consciously, with one of the really big examples being the Drow, which is a thing that I talked about in the last live stream. In the last live stream, I mentioned the origins of Drow in Pathfinder, which is that there were a group of elves who wanted to stay on Galarian during Earthfall. So what they did was they went underground, and underground they were exposed to the whispers of Rovagug, and the whispers of Rovagug drove them insane and turned them evil, and over time they evolved into the Drow that we know today. That's actually a very interesting lore thing. I really like that origin story, and it suggests that like Rovagug just like being in the area underneath the planet's like surface is enough to expose you to Rovagugian corruption, which makes sense if you examine the sheer number of like evil creatures that exist within the not the Underdark, but the Darklands. Among other things, there's creatures like Gugs, which are creatures from a dimension of dreams that just don't like people and that worship the Lovecraftian deities. There are the Drow, there's the Daragar, who are like gray dwarves who worship Droskar, who is like the god of hard work and like endless toil. And they're also evil. In fact, they're honestly probably like the single worst force that exists in the Darklands, because they live in the surface. They live like in the area closest to the surface, and they are enormous slavers. And their whole thing is they run cities of slaves. So they'll go out to the surface, they'll capture surface dwellers, they'll bring them to the Darklands, and then when they're in the Darklands, they'll trade them with other civilizations, most notably the Drow, who really like having slaves and using slave labor, and also performing human sacrifice. Not necessarily like human sacrifice in the very literal sense, but like the sacrifice of sentient creatures to demons and demon lords. So it's an evil civilization that very much enjoys feeding other evil civilizations. We are going to talk about the Droskar when we talk about the dwarven like myths and legends, which very well might be next week's live stream, because the dwarves in Galarian have like a really distinct prophecy that led them to escape from the Darklands. And along the way, they started fighting orcs, which is actually like how orcs went from being in the Darklands to the surface. And some say that that resulted in the creation of one entire deity. And it's not actually true, sort of, if you are like looking at timeline stuff, but it's really interesting. And we're going to talk about that at a later date. Basically, Rovagug is this giant evil beetle, and if you're not careful, he'll fuck up your whole shit. It's actually very fun to talk about him. I find this specific lore and mythos to be extremely interesting. I also like the idea of like campaigns that involve Rovagug as like an active force, because Rovagug and Rovagugians are not enormous aspects of any player adventure. Lots of like resources that Paizo, which is the company that runs Pathfinder, have created exists to help you run a Rovagug-centric campaign, but they are not like... Rovagug is not an enormous character in any adventure path. One of the most important adventure paths featuring him is Second Darkness, which is the Dark Elf adventure path. And I mean Dark Elf adventure path in the sense that Dark Elves are the antagonists, not that you play as Dark Elves. I'm trying to think of like other instances where Rovagug or even Rovagugians appear in adventure paths. There are definitely like a few isolated instances where you encounter Rovagugians and where you either have to fuck up their whole shit or you have to get your shit rocked by them, which is not always the like most fun thing in the world. But I mean, I personally think that this is a very interesting deity. It involves lots of like ultra in the lore stuff. One of the most important aspects of that, which is actually fairly new, is that Rovagug is the manifestation of one of Pharasma's fears. That wasn't Rovagug's like original origin, but was an origin story that they decided to throw in to explain why it is that Rovagug exists. So originally, lots of stuff that wasn't explained was explained in something called the Windsong Testaments, which is a story, a little fable that I talked about in the last live stream, where I talked about the idea that there has to be like a survivor from a current iteration of reality, someone who would survive into the next iteration, and also the sort of Lord of Time, Yog-Sothoth, in order to create a new iteration of reality. That story comes from the Windsong Testaments, which is just sort of like in our universe, so in the real world, it is an explanation for why it is that the lore is set up the way that it is. But like in universe, it's an explanation for a lot of heretical ideas that are probably like canonically true in universe. If you are doing a not super homebrewy campaign where you are doing like the most lore stuff you can possible, that's probably the explanation that you would go with, especially because the older iterations of reality are hyper-canonical things that exist in Pathfinder. That doesn't mean you have to use them, but they're definitely things that exist because like it's mentioned every single time that the outer gods are talked about, that they exist beyond the multiverse. It's talked about in Zonkathon's origin story that he went beyond the great beyond, so he went into some unknown place, and that was where he was corrupted. There are other instances of creatures going into the great beyond and then coming out changed, with one of them being one of the origin stories of Devourers, which are a very powerful undead creature that you can begin to face. I think it's like a CR 15 undead creature, where there are different types of origins, but like the most common one is that it's a fiend who was killed by another devourer, or it's a fiend who went beyond reality and then came back changed as a devourer. Devourers are these huge corpse-like motherfuckers who have a giant hole in their chest, and they are like eating the souls of those that they kill. It's one of the ways that if you die in Pathfinder, your normal experience upon death can be disrupted, along with a daemon eating you or you making a deal with one of the lesser planes. So if you made a deal with a demon or with a devil and you like signed your soul away, that would disrupt the journey. If you were reincarnated, that would disrupt the journey. If a Astra daemon, which is this like shark-like creature from Abaddon, which is the neutral evil plane, manages to be the one that gets you, it will start to immediately devour your soul. And also, depending on what sort of a creature you are, if you're killed by a Balor, they can also start to immediately devour your soul. There is a creature that's known as a Balor Lord, which is the most powerful type of Balor and the like third most powerful type of demon beyond nascent demon lords and then actual demon lords that have the ability to just kill you outright. So the way that this works mechanically is if you're within a certain range of it, it can do an action to just look at you and inhale you. And if it succeeds, you just die and your soul is devoured and it's able to gain some health. And it's just a thing that it can do. So Balor Lords are really hard to fight. But none of the Balor Lords that you've actually encountered in adventure paths to date have this power. I can remember very explicitly 2 Balor Lords that have very different powers. There's some asshole, they're both in the same adventure path. There's some asshole who can like summon swarms, and he can control swarms. So he will just sick a bunch of insects on you. And there's also another Balor Lord who, instead of having like an aura of flames that causes whoever is near them to suffer constant fire damage, it has an aura of electricity that can like paralyze people if they fail a saving throw. And there's also other Balor Lord powers, but those are the ones that have been seen by characters that exist in adventure paths. So if you're designing a Balor Lord of your own as a sort of end campaign antagonist, or if you are running a mythic level campaign and you have one as like a sort of mid-level boss, then you can use different powers. Like you can have one that gets super strong and super sexy whenever it kills someone. You can have one that, if it's fighting an angel, turns into basically an unbeatable behemoth. You can have one that just has way more spells known than others. These sorts of Balor Lord powers are outlined in the first bestiary, which is like the first monster manual for Pathfinder, and also in a resource called Demons Revisited that uses, I think it's like either the 8 or 10 most commonly encountered types of demons and creates like resources for them. Some of the other demons that it includes are the Babadoo, which is this asshole that just kills people. It's a murder demon. The Succubi, which is the demon of lust. The Varrock, which is the demon of wrath. And also the Individuac, also known as the Shadow Demon, which is a demon that just possesses you. And it's a really interesting resource. You can find it for free if you know where to look, but I recommend buying it. I purchased my copy like forever ago, and it's one of my favorite resources when I am creating demons in the stories that I write, just because I really like the ideas that it has. And yeah, it's been an hour now, so I'm thinking that we are going to go ahead and begin to wrap stuff up. But I hope that you all are having an absolutely wonderful holiday time. I know that if you are an estadounidense like me, if you're an American homie, these are very uncertain times, and I understand being worried about that. In fact, one of the big reasons why I wanted to do this live stream is that I wanted to take my mind off of stuff politically, and talking about Pathfinder is always a very fun time. I have really enjoyed the time that I've spent today with y'all. I hope that you guys have had fun listening to me just nerd out and go deep into Pathfinder lore. The resources that I used are the Windsong Testament, Inner Sea Faiths and Gods and Magic, which are absolutely enormous resources that are books that you can buy, and they outline details from like godly history, and they talk about like the purposes of the clerics and like what it is that a cleric's mission will do. They also talk about like sayings that are unique to the faith and things like holidays. Rovagug doesn't really have many holidays. Basically, it's just like Rovagug really likes it when people break shit. And sometimes Rovagugians will celebrate a day where like they broke something really nice. And they're honestly just really fun assholes. I actually really like the idea of doing a Rovagugian heavy campaign in D&D. I don't think that Rovagug is actually the antagonist I would use if I ran a like Pathfinder campaign. I think I said D&D earlier. That was my mistake. You guys know what I meant. But he is absolutely one of the more interesting characters that exists in like Pathfinder deep lore. And it's really interesting to read about the impact that he's had on Galarian, because Rovagug is partially responsible for a lot of stuff. It's sometimes implied that Rovagug is one of the corruptors who ended up being responsible for the Serpent Folk Empire, which was an empire of really bad stuff, even though they had their own snake deity who manifested on Galarian and is the antagonist of an adventure path. I think it's really interesting just to read about the influence of both Rovagug and Rovagug's spawn, because effectively, if you are in a place and you see a spawn of Rovagug, that place is fucked. Like, at most, they will be able to have some people survive, but the place itself is probably destroyed. So it's really fun to read about instances where a Rovaguggian spawn was actually put down, like that city in Osarian, where people came together and succeeded against a creature that wanted to wipe out all of existence. It's also really inspiring to read about deities setting aside their differences, and in some cases, like pausing wars that they were fighting to be able to collaborate to put down a threat to all of existence. One of the biggest events and one of the only instances in Pathfinder lore where deities were killed was when they were stopping Rovagug. There are a handful of other instances. There's that moon goddess that I mentioned earlier. There's Aradun's death, which is extremely mysterious. And when I talk about like the history of humanity in Golarion, I'll absolutely talk about Aradun specifically and the impact that his death has had on the Pathfinder universe. But effectively, the death of Aradun was like the inciting event for many current things that are happening, even as recently as the current year in Golarion. And I think that's really exciting. I really like that the people over at Paizo have created such an in-depth universe with so much lore to learn from. And even if you don't play Pathfinder, if you play any sort of TTRPG, I hope that you get inspired by watching this sort of live stream and by listening to me chat about the sort of stuff that I find fascinating, because I'm a huge nerd. And just thinking about ways that can impact your own games, whether it's a game that you are a game master of, or it's something that you're just a player in. And I am definitely looking forward to more weeks where we dive deep into Pathfinder lore and we summarize it and we have fun and we talk about it. So I'm going to go ahead and let y'all get back to your families and stuff. But I hope that everyone here has a wonderful holiday season, and I look forward to chatting with you next week. I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast.